Welcome, friend. Tonight I want to take you into a world where beauty and danger braided themselves together so tightly that you could no longer tell where inspiration ended and exploitation began. If you find this kind of calm, careful history soothing or startling in equal measure, please subscribe now so you won't miss the rest of this channel's deep examinations of the past. Stay with me to the end. I promise you will see something familiar in a very different light. Picture Paris after the war, the city still reeling but alive with a hunger for new forms of expression. The streets still smelled of coal and smoke, but inside certain cafes the air vibrated with a different electricity. Artists smoked and argued. Writers recited fragments of sentences that later shook entire literary movements. Painters slashed canvases with brushes that seemed to know more than their hands. These rooms felt like truth. They felt like refuge. And for many they were exactly that. But beneath the perfume and soft laughter, something darker moved. A commerce that traded not just in paintings and words, but in human fragility. Imagine a young man arriving with a battered suitcase and a stubborn faith in his future. He survived the war. The trenches lived in his bones. Sleep won't come, and the dreams he tries to paint at night are haunted and urgent. He wanders into a cafe that promises warmth and conversation. The owner notices the way he tilts his head at certain paintings, the hunger in his eyes. Soon, a needle will feel like an answer, a sharp hush to the screaming inside. And overnight, his work changes. Critics call it visionary. The same thing that stole his nights and his health becomes the reason his name moves from whispered corner to printed review. That is the tragic pattern at the heart of this story. This is not the romantic myth of the struggling artist finding inspiration in vice. This is a system that learned to convert aspiration into revenue. It built rituals, coded phrases, private stairways, second-floor rooms that were never on the official map. The cafes were front rooms and theaters, and what passed across their tables was as likely to be a brushstroke as a kilogram of chemical escape. Requests for the special coffee meant something else entirely. Asking after paints might mean the most dangerous supply. Business was disguised by art. Transactions were concealed as commissions. A painting sold for far more than it was worth because the money laundered drugs into a social economy and gave a veneer of respectability to crimes that preyed on grief, loneliness, and pride. The period following the war left a generation raw. Men returned with hollow eyes, and women who had held communities together were suddenly free from certain social constraints. A new class of visitors arrived from abroad, rich, restless, often young, eager to drink in what they believed was cosmopolitan freedom. With them came new money and new risks. The temptation to belong, to feel seen, to be told one's suffering had meaning, was irresistible. Dealers and operators recognized this. They built networks where the image of rebellion, of artistic authenticity, became the shroud that hid organized criminality. Women and men with names you might imagine on a gallery roster became central figures in these networks, but not always by choice. Some were patrons who arrived thinking they were supporting art and left paying for an addiction they would not be able to outrun. Others were artists whose hunger for an edge made them vulnerable to those who promised a quick route to altered perception. Some were schemers, clever organizers who saw the mechanics of art sales as perfect cover for trafficking and money laundering. They recruited, cultivated, and cataloged. They kept records not just of debts and sales, but of temperaments and vulnerabilities. Who had a broken home? Who had lost a lover to the trenches? Who needed recognition more than anything else? Those were the people who would be groomed. One cafe owner, call her Madame Noire, ran a place that looked at first glance like an ordinary bohemian spot. Low light, chipped wooden tables, paintings pinned to walls. But Madame Noire's operation extended beyond the bar. She cultivated a clientele of the hungry and the influential. She learned the code that allowed the right hands to reach the right rooms. Under her watch, artistic breakthroughs and tragic dependencies walked the same path. Her formula was simple and cruel. Make the circle intimate. Make the drugs seem like an ingredient for understanding. Normalize the ritual. Build a market where a painting functioned as a receipt and an excuse. Some patrons were newly liberated expatriates in search of sensation. Others were aristocrats and wealthy heirs, lonely behind their estates and curious about the promises of modern life. A Boston socialite who once thought herself a patron of the avant-garde would suddenly find her Sunday salons turned into distribution points. She'd buy paintings she did not love to hide the payments that bought her access to narcotics and to keep her secrets in plain sight. The art became collateral. The canvas was the ledger. It was a brilliant system because it fed every human weakness. The hunger for status, the need for belonging, the vanity of believing oneself above the law. Within these rooms, the lines between patron, artist, and dealer blurred. A dealer might pay an artist with drugs and accept the work as payment because the dealer knew that the same work would draw even more funds from a trusting purchaser. Critics, too, were sometimes complicit, dazzled by the energy and desperate for new stories to champion. A glowing review could inflate a price, and an inflated price fed the cycle. When the stakes become both cultural and financial, art itself becomes hostage. But the business side of the operation displayed an even more chilling sophistication. It was not merely about selling a substance or flattering a collector. It was about creating a market with its own rules. Specialist chemists refined products to exacting standards. There were man-made laboratories hidden behind legitimate facades. Quality mattered, because a weak batch could ruin a patron who had become essential to commerce or to influence. Tools of trade were honed with the same precision an artist might apply to a brush stroke. Supply chains stretched across borders and hidden accounting disguised the flow of money. As this network grew, so did its tentacles. Bankers, willing or coerced, processed transfers. Shipping companies moved crates labeled as canvases while inside were pharmaceutical vials. Diplomatic channels were sometimes abused, with people exploiting status and immunity. And once the money started moving in clever loops of art sales and fake valuations, the criminal enterprise gained insulation. It became a hybrid, part gallery, part cartel, part intelligence apparatus. In that shape, it was far deadlier than anyone had imagined. When the first deaths began to appear with alarming frequency among expatriate circles and well-placed families, complacency turned to suspicion. The deaths were often written off as tragedies of excess, until a picture changed everything. A single photograph taken by someone who had stumbled into a scene by chance captured a tableau that could not be explained away. It showed not only the act of drug use, but the exploitation of youth, the deliberate grooming of minors, and the presence of wealthy youths whose families would not have expected to be targets. That image broke the veil. Families began to ask uncomfortable questions. Embassies demanded answers. An inspector, methodical, patient, determined, was handed a case that would not let go. He did not go after brushstrokes. He followed ledgers and hotel registrations. A concierge with decades of keen observation became his source. Small details, late-night visitors, packages that seemed out of place, a change in a young tenant's behavior, provided the breadcrumbs that led to an understanding of an entire system. What investigators uncovered made the problem look far bigger than anyone had predicted. The cafes were nodes in a network. Each had its specialty, each a clientele, each a role. One might cater to wealthy tourists, another to artists who preferred a certain chemical for its psychedelic effect, another to those who wanted the needle's silence. The real sophistication lay in how these nodes were coordinated. Financial systems hid the flows. The artwork market was manipulated to launder proceeds. Bankers and clerks, sometimes out of greed and sometimes out of coercion, enabled transfers that allowed the network to reach beyond any single city. It was not a loose set of dealers. It was an enterprise. And as the enterprise matured, its ambition spread. It was not satisfied with local gains. It tested the idea of replication. The techniques used in these cafes could be taught and adapted. Manuals were drafted. How to identify vulnerable young patrons, how to normalize drug use as a form of cultural insight, how to structure transactions that looked like patronage. That dark blueprint imagined the same model planted in other cities with concentrations of wealthy, emotionally fragile young people. London, Berlin, New York, environments where elite curiosity and social displacement intersected, suddenly looked like fertile ground for replication. The network's reach revealed a terrifying capacity for social engineering. It did not merely sell substances. It sold belonging, identity, status. It created rituals and then monetized them. It produced a social economy in which addiction was rewarded with respect and autonomy traded for control. Leaving the network was not simply a matter of quitting a drug. It required severing social ties, admitting that what one believed to be authentic was actually manufactured, and facing the shame of being exploited. As the net tightened, investigators found corruption in places that should have been safe. Police officials whose duty was to investigate had been quietly compromised. Some took payments to look the other way. Others were entangled by compromised relationships. Galleries and critics, whose job was to discover beauty and challenge taste, sometimes accepted favors or flattering narratives that served the network's interests. Even institutions that existed to heal, doctors and psychiatrists intrigued by the therapeutic potential of certain substances, were sometimes pulled into the web. Their legitimacy provided cover and, in return, they were given access to supplies, status, and the chance to be part of an inner circle. The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the discoveries. Bank records revealed sums moving in patterns that could not be explained by the sale of art. Shipping manifests showed crates of materials that did not match their declared contents. Hotel registries contained false names connected to people who were not who they seemed. Interviews with those who had been caught revealed an engine whose operators had documented tactics, profiles, and techniques for psychological manipulation. Manuals that read less like crime notes and more like instruction manuals for social predation. The enterprise did more than prey on individuals' artistic ambitions. It learned to weaponize influence. Some of the most disturbing revelations showed how those compromised inside society, artists, patrons, diplomats, aristocrats, could be used as entry points to intelligence, finance, and political power. The same social proofs that invited a young heir to a salon could also author an avenue through which sensitive information leaked. Letters and conversations intended for intimate salons were repurposed into intelligence. A reputation for cosmopolitanism became a cloak under which far more dangerous exchanges could happen. When the scandals spilled into the press and into the halls of embassies, the response gathered speed. International outrage forced officials to act. A coordinated set of raids closed multiple cafes at once. Arrests were made across the network. Evidence seized in those actions painted an ugly portrait, not of a few rogue dealers, but of an organization with procedural sophistication, financial managers, and a reach that crossed borders. The investigations revealed that what once had been easy to dismiss as bohemian excess was instead an enterprise that had weaponized culture to its own ends. The collapse that followed did not end neatly. For many involved, the criminal structure's unraveling created complicated consequences. Some found pathways to recovery, learning to rebuild their lives and their art. Others descended further into poverty, exile, or death. For a number of artists whose most acclaimed work had been created during the era of addiction, the question of legacy remained agonizing. Should the art be preserved and celebrated despite how it was produced? Or did recognizing its value reward the exploiters who manufactured the conditions that produced it? There is no easy answer. Art that emerges from suffering can be profound. Art that emerges through exploitation is morally compromised in ways that the market and the academy struggle to account for. Beyond individual fates, the scandal left scars on cultural institutions. The suspicion that cultured activity could be a mask for criminal enterprise eroded public trust. Funding for experimental programs dried up. Ordinary cafes and galleries that had nothing to do with the network found themselves stigmatized. Neighborhoods known for creativity declined as residents and patrons retreated. The very social flourishing that had made these districts vital was starved by fear. But there were important lessons buried in the wreckage. The scandal forced authorities and institutions to develop new tools. Law enforcement began to think beyond traditional models of crime. Intelligence services learned to recognize the ways cultural mobility and social prestige could be exploited. Universities and journals developed safeguards to preserve research integrity. Therapeutic communities investigated new ways to treat not only chemical dependency but the manufactured dependencies created by extended manipulation, forms of psychological bondage that outlasted physical withdrawal. And still, perhaps most troubling of all, is the knowledge that the techniques discovered in those shadowed rooms were not confined to a single era or a single city. The manuals, the patterns, the lessons in recruitment and exploitation became part of a dark inheritance. They showed how openness and tolerance, those strengths of democratic life, could be used against themselves when malicious actors mastered the art of social engineering. As you listen, consider the human scale of this story. Think of the young man who made brilliant paintings in a half-sleep trance, whose genius was celebrated even as his body crumbled. Think of patrons who wanted to belong and were monetized for their desires. Think of ordinary citizens and institutions who found their trust weaponized. These are not abstractions. They are people whose lives were remade by strategies that treated human longing as raw material. Now imagine how those strategies could be adapted elsewhere. A social circle in another city. A gallery opening in a different language. A university research grant that channels influence. The pattern is simple to learn and devastating to deploy. That is why the scandal mattered far beyond the cafes themselves, because it taught a dangerous lesson about how to convert admiration and curiosity into leverage. Before we close, I want to invite you into a quieter part of the story. There were survivors who rebuilt, who learned new ways of making, who created art that did not require chemical escape to reach truth. Their recoveries were messy and incomplete, but they mattered. They remind us that creativity is resilient and that human beings can reclaim their dignity even after extraordinary betrayal. They also show that institutions can, and must, do better by offering real communities of support that replace predatory systems with authentic, sustainable networks of care. If you found this exploration meaningful, please consider subscribing now. Your subscription helps keep this channel producing patient, well-researched histories like this one. If you liked the video, press like and leave a comment below with your thoughts. Tell me which part of the story surprised you most. Did the idea that art and exploitation can be entangled in such precise, institutional ways change how you think about cultural narratives? I read every thoughtful comment, and I often use viewer questions to guide future episodes. And before you go, I want to leave you with a few questions to carry with you into your day. Who today might be using culture or prestige as a cover for harmful activities? How do we protect open societies from manipulation while still preserving the freedoms that make creative life possible? When we encounter work that seems brilliant but comes from destructive circumstances, how should we judge it? Do we separate art from its context, or must context always color our value judgments? If any of those questions resonate, tell me in the comments which one grabbed you, and why. Share this video with someone who loves history or cultural analysis. That helps this kind of careful work reach more people who want to think critically about the past and its echoes in our present. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me. If you want a companion reading list, primary sources, or a transcript formatted for text-to-speech performance, tell me in the comments and I will prepare those next. For now, be safe, stay curious, and I will see you in the next story.